Hey, everybody, this is Dr. John back with the latest episode of the Evolved Caveman podcast. Thanks for joining us. And today it is my distinct privilege to have with me Dr. Jason Frishman. And Jason is going to do his own intro today because we had a little glitch in the matrix over a bio. So Jason, would you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. And I like to talk about myself as we all do, so I don't mind that. Let's see. So I'll start with what's most important to me is I am a husband and a father of two. I have two young sons. I live for me is what is Shangri-La. I live in rural Vermont, in a place that I envisioned back when I was a child. When I was a kid, I said I wanted to live in Vermont, and I envisioned even the type of house that I live in now. And so I'm incredibly sort of grateful and really aware of the fact that I've landed in a place I've always wanted to. But more than that, on top of that, I'm a psychologist. I'm a narrative coach. I run a coaching program for men and fathers where I really focus on allowing and supporting men to discover who they are and how to connect more powerfully at home with the people whom they love the most. And so I would say that, we were talking a little bit about some of the things I should include. I will say some of the interesting things professionally is I have a master's degree in adventure therapy, and I have a doctorate degree where I focused on something called narrative therapy. So I'm
And
an
we're going to hit on
adventure
both those.
storyteller
Yeah,
or a storytelling adventurer, one of the two, one or the other.
I love it. So let's get into the narrative and the adventure
Yeah.
therapy, because adventure therapy was something I didn't even know there was a degree in.
I don't know if there is anymore. At the time, there's a big community. There's an international adventure therapy conference, and so it does exist. So, but before my degree, most people went and got some mixture of a therapy or counseling degree with an outdoor ed degree, and they sort of matched it that way. I was in a master's program in Southern United States where there was a very well-known outdoor ed program and a very well-known psychology program, and the school merged it. And they graduated 3 or 4 years worth of students of cohorts. And because of it was in the state of Georgia, because of the laws in Georgia around licensure and things like that, they felt like they needed to stop. So at the time, I was able to say I'm one of 9 degreed adventure therapists in the world. Now I think there are more, but I don't know what other programs are out there. But it is really a unique take on both therapy and growth with people. So it's been a huge impact on who I am as a professional and as a person.
Yeah, it sounds like a great way to go, especially for men. So speaking of men, let's get into the
Yeah.
whole idea of hero's journey, because you have a unique take on the hero's journey, a la Joseph Campbell. And tell me about your unique take on this.
Sure. It starts the bigger context is I love the hero's journey. I love the narrative. I wrote my dissertation from in the metaphor of the hero's journey. And I would say the first 10 years of my career, I used the ideas of the hero's journey as primarily as the base for the therapy I did, whether it was experiential adventure or in an office. The way that I designed questions and supported people was using adventure therapy as a model, or narrative. I'm sorry, the hero's journey as a model. But one of the tenets of narrative therapy is to question taken for granted stories in culture. So being aware of dominant stories and the impact they have on who we are as individuals and who we are as cultural members. So after about 10 years of doing workshops and leading programs or classes and doing therapy, I always ask the question, what's your favorite adventure story, real or fictional? Or, I would encourage any of your listeners, like right now, take a moment. What's your favorite adventure story? What comes to mind?
Yeah, can we go over just a few examples? Star Wars, Indiana Jones,
Yeah.
Iliad,
Yeah. I mean,
Odyssey.
those are all the ones that come up. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, not necessarily even in the fantasy sci-fi realm, Little House on the Prairie, right? Like going off and doing something in an unknown area, right? Like the hero's journey narrative, in a very short way of putting it, is you have a hero who gets either called out of their home area, or falls, like gets kicked out, has to travel to another area, another realm, another area geographically, and is tested and tasked, and has to challenge themselves, and with help from others and whatnot, battles a dragon, climbs a mountain, gets the treasure, and somehow has to find their way home, where they're either exalted or shunned. And it's the developmental path of what happens to the character in that narrative, right?
Excellent. Thank you.
And again, it's a wonderful story. But after about 10 years of asking this and always getting the same answers, my narrative training kicked in. I was like, okay, I love this story, but I guess I have to question it, right? And the easiest way to answer to demonstrate the question was, all right, once the hero leaves to go off on this grand adventure, what about everyone who stays home? What about everyone who's in the fields, or keeping the hearth burning, or wiping the butts, or, doing dishes? Aren't their lives adventurous as well? And isn't there magic in their everyday life that is powerful, right? Like, shouldn't there be? And so as soon as I started that question, I started noticing so much of the work that I do with men, in my psychotherapy practice, in my coaching practice, in many ways has to do with this. If I'm not epic, if I'm not legendary, then what am I? And as a result, men are angry. They're, confused. They're lost. They're misdirected. There's so
Depressed.
many
Yeah.
depressed, anxious, all of these things. And I'm not suggesting that all of it has to do with it, but I think there's a really big part
Yeah.
that our culture's stories teach us how to be. And the way that we use language and media and perpetrate certain stories. I mean, I would hope that any of your readers, even if they haven't heard of the hero's journey per se, by now are going, oh yeah, okay. Every Pixar movie uses it.
Well,
Every
it makes
Disney
it
movie
makes me
uses it.
think of like men that are stay-at-home dads, and how
Yeah,
that really weighs on everyone that I've talked to. And I did that myself for a few years when I was in graduate school. And like I think that it really weighs on us in terms of our self-worth, because it's not a part of the hero's
absolutely.
journey. And I'm not out there fighting dragons or doing something awe-inspiring. It's rather
Exactly,
mundane,
right.
and it's kind of thankless.
100%. Which, and in many ways, and this brings up even bigger issues, is that the hero's journey is by definition a very masculine story, even though, I mean, there's been a lot of effort by movie makers and writers to have women be the center of these stories or whatnot. But in a bigger picture, the hero's journey is a narrative that is a masculine narrative, whether or not the main characters are men or women. And I might even argue it's a narrative that supports sort of patriarchal kind of dominance-based thinking, right? In the hero's journey, we're not looking at shades of gray. We're looking at right or wrong, good and
Mhm.
bad, and there's a proponent that, or it propagate, or it, I'm getting the wrong keyword, but anyway, it promotes this thinking that, like, we've got to go off and do great things and conquer. Um, we don't think a lot about befriending the dragon, even though that does happen in some stories. It's usually about taming the dragon or freeing, it's something that involves our power, right?
Mhm.
And so you're right, stay-at-home dads, or dads in general, right? Like dads who are working their butt off, going off to work and making a good living, but then come home and like aren't, even if they think they're doing amazing things, if they're not like, honored and whatever the way that we're taught that people returning heroes are, then there's like a lostness, from dads who come home and don't know what to do in the home, and aren't connecting with their kids and aren't connecting with their partners. And so there is this one-sidedness of the hero's journey. When I first started playing with this, I actually, my program, which is now called Journeymen, was originally called Adventure's Other Half.
Hmm.
And it was, I was playing with the hashtag, Joseph Campbell was wrong for a long time, mostly to see if I could get some conversation about it. And what Joseph Campbell and his contemporaries, whatever, were, you know, men in a particular context who were, putting things out. And it's wonderful. Like I said, I love the concept, but it's not that we have to throw that story out, but it's unbalanced.
Yeah.
It really is. It shows only, frankly, the way I say it is, if like when in the hero's journey stories, when the hero is, let's say, down and out and the dragon is stepping on his head, what happens? Usually there's a flashback, or he reaches into his pocket and finds a token of a talisman, and he's reminded of what's really important. And it's usually like someone at home, or, the reason why he's doing it. And yet the whole story about why that's important is maybe given 3 minutes of a montage, right? So it's like a really unbalanced story. We are told about the adventures and all these great things, but we're not told about the 20 years of closeness with a partner, or practicing with a sword, or the meaning and the values of why people do the things they do to go on quests.
Well, it also makes me think that the hero's journey dovetails almost perfectly with the man box culture that we grow up in, right? Be dominant,
Yes.
compete, be aggressive, be self-reliant, don't back down. And yeah, I mean, it makes me think that we're trained by society to be soldiers at some level. I mean, it's like society's way to train us to be heroic, to fight for our country, to protect our resources, to protect our women. And I think that's a very narrow view of masculinity and men in general. You're right, it only hits
100%.
maybe half of the picture. And I think that's one of our big problems, right? Is we get cut off from, I would argue, 2/3 of the emotional spectrum, along with other parts of ourselves. And then it creates this inauthenticity, this disconnect, and this misery.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And so many men have sit in my office or have been in the groups that I run where we talk about this, and it is our culture's stories, whether it's the hero's journey or similar ones, glorify certain things and denigrate others. And it's no surprise to people who are thinking about it that much of the things that are glorified are man box attributes, and most of the things that are denigrated are stereotypically women, female attributes, right? Staying home, nurturing, taking care of, feeding, all of these things. And so, yeah, when there's a man who's either doing that and not getting any sort of oomph or societal support for it, or men who don't do it are feeling lost. Like, we know if we're living only half a life, I think that's where we have higher levels of suicide, substance abuse, or even simpler, dissociation
Addiction,
with
yeah,
phones and
phones.
Addictions and things like that. And
Well, I really like your
yeah,
phrase of like befriending the dragon, because that to me brings up acceptance and commitment therapy, or this idea of turning towards those parts of ourselves, either shadow parts or uncomfortable emotions, shame, guilt, depression come to mind. And I think that's a really overlooked aspect of men getting to heal themselves.
I couldn't agree more. Befriending, narrative work uses a lot of metaphors, and I've been a writer, and I love,
metaphors.
so metaphor is super powerful, right? And in the hero's journey, and in man box culture, and frankly in Western culture, we have very limited metaphors when it comes to dealing with the stuff of life, right? So in the therapy world, we are very, I think, uncomfortably landed in the medical model. And the medical model has a very limited metaphor for healing. It's like, we kill it, we cut it out, or we, cure it or banish it from the kingdom, right? Like, that's kind of, that's kind of what we have. And so it's not surprising that in our hero's journey, we have battle or kill the dragon, right? And of course, people have stretched that a little bit in lots of ways. But, right, and acceptance and commitment therapy about befriending the dragon, but even more so in some of the work I do with men now, with the journeyman work, I have them create the metaphor for what they want to do with their issues, as opposed to me imposing it, right? And I have lists of all the, we can tame the, in our work, because we're not battling dragons. In the journeyman work, we actually are encountering imps, our little imps. They're little buggers that run around trying to,
like that.
mess things up. But the thing is that I have been able to say over years of doing this, that if we really look at the history of your relationship with this imp, and we talk to the imp, we embody it, the imp's going to say, what are you talking about? I'm doing this to protect you. I'm doing, I've actually got your best interest in mind. And most guys start off by going, no way, this guy's an a-hole, right?
Yeah.
Like, but once we really look at it, then new metaphors emerge, right? We're not just going to battle it. We're not going to kill it. We're not going to banish it, whether it's anxiety, depression, all those things. Can we tame it? Can we train it? Can we teach it or empower it? Can we,
or renegotiate a new role with it, like IFS, the interpersonal
100%.
systems, right? Like I love that work.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very similar. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so what is, hey, if you want, you've already got entrance, right? The imp's already got a key. So and it's saying it's got my best interest in mind. So let's relate to it differently. Let's see what can we make it a minion? Can we have it sit at our table? Can we have it be on our council? Like the metaphors are incredibly powerful. I have guys who, were in my program about 2 years ago and we still connect, and they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so, his imp showed up the other day and I had to like remind it what it was doing. And, it's a really powerful way to look at the things for a number of reasons, but one of which I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when we look at our stuff as an embodied imp, I don't have to identify with it as myself. I don't have to say it's all me. I'm screwed up. I'm this, I'm that. I have this tendency, this pattern, this story that gets in the way in a way that it historically helped me, that kept me safe, that like, even if it was never particularly functional, it kept me safe.
Yeah.
And well, all right, if I have that piece of me, that part of me, maybe I can work with it, but it's not all
I love that
me.
idea of parts or imps that, developed at a younger age, typically in some difficult situation. And we came up with the best strategy or solution that we could at that age. And then that part comes out at different times, generally to protect us when
Right.
it perceives threat or difficulty. And so I think to look at that as like, oh, that's the 5-year-old me or the 5-year-old imp me. And to be able to look at it with curiosity and without judgment and with some kindness, that's a huge step. Because I do think that a lot of this healing work is actually inner child work at this point in my career. That's kind of where I've landed.
Yeah,
And a
I
lot
can
of the
see
stuff
that.
we
Yeah, I
say,
mean,
do, feel, is really, a lot of it's coming out from early childhood, and we're just not aware of it. And it's not quite that simple, but there's a overweighted impact by those imps.
absolutely. I mean, we have to know our backstory.
Yeah.
We have to have an understanding of our origins and our backstory and how things came to be. Because if in the moment we recognize if things aren't working well, and I'm on automatic, if I'm reacting instead of responding, then the pathways that were created throughout my life, those are the ones I'm going to walk on.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of other topics I want to get to, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that you do and think about. And one of the things that I want to cover is archetypes. And I guess we could talk about through Campbell. I guess we could talk about through Carl Jung. But the archetypes that we normally hear about, particularly in men's work, are things like the king, the magician, maybe the warrior, and the lover.
Right?
Yeah, there you go. And what are some of the other archetypes which maybe those are the dragon, right, that we view negatively, but actually have something important to teach us? What are the lesser known?
It's a great question.
Some of the lesser known archetypes.
It's a great question. But before we even get into that, if I can create a little context, is,
Please.
I think I love archetypes, and I think they're really a wonderful way of understanding the world and the stories within it. I think they're often quite misunderstood, and I'm not going to pretend to be a full expert in them at all. But as soon as we name an archetype, it loses some of its power. Right, because archetypes in many ways are stories that, in the way that Jung talked about it in the the collective unconscious, there's like, a bubbling eruption of lava that every once in a while something pops through, and the meaning can be different. The same thing pops through one side of the world or another side of the world. They're going to have a different name. They're going to have a different meaning. They're going to have,
pardon me, Camelot.
yes,
Arthur.
yes. But it's true, like there are different different energies and patterns and stories will be given different names, meanings, and value, depending on the culture and the time period and the, the gender, whomever is using it. So as soon as we name something and we give it a meaning, right? The king, the warrior, the magician, the lover, those are men's, those are masculine, and there are people who really hold very tight. They'll even say, no, it's not men, they're masculine, and women can have that energy too. And which is true, but it is so much more fluid than that. And so, I think what's really important when we think about archetypes is that they are stories, and stories can be interpreted in different ways. They can be, there's some people who believe that archetypes are a real thing. They're energetically living, and that they do pop up. Some people believe them to be social constructions, that are passed along through culture. It's undeniable that in every culture, not every, many cultures over time, a tree was an important symbol, an egg was an important symbol. Like these things, it's not, it's there's a truth to that. But the meaning is can and should be evolving, right? Yeah. So to go to your question, right, the king, warrior, magician, lover as masculine archetypes, it started in the 80s-ish with or 70s and 80s with the men's movement, the mythopoetic men's movement around, with Robert Bly and
Iron John,
these kinds of Iron John, right? Like I have that here. And it's lovely because it does give us a model to try to do better. But I actually think the focus on king, warrior, magician, lover in the same way that archetypes of the hero's journey are not helpful as much as they should be today as maybe they were back then, is because they're still promoting some of this black and white thinking, good and bad, like strong and weak. There's a dichotomy that is or a dualism that is promoted that promotes patriarchal thought and dominance-based thinking. And so all of that, I mean, even in Iron John, he starts off the book by saying, essentially, there are other archetypes for men or masculine ones, but those are soft. And even though I like soft men, they don't have much to give to us.
Yeah, and one of the big things there that I just need to add is I think one of the important, simple distinctions for listeners out there is that we're trying to move from a mindset of power over to power with.
Yeah.
And
I would even say power over
patriarchy, it's all about power over. And I think what we're trying to evolve to is greater cooperation, collaboration, power with other people, consent, agreement, that kind of thing, not power over. And I think we get inculcated and brainwashed with this power over idea.
Absolutely. And I would even say, in terms of power with, I would say partnership. Right. To me, connections and partnership are the goal. And that's what, as maturing men and masculinity, that's the goal is creating partnerships with the people around us and the people whom we care about, and not dominance or I love power over is certainly there. But so to give an example of a different archetype that I use quite a bit, which because again, if we think about the hero's journey being one of the dominant stories in our culture right now, we look at everything through the lens, right? So we're wearing glasses that everything we see is seen through this narrative. So if I said, hey, there's a great blockbuster movie about weeding the garden and it being your turn to clean the toilets, no one would be excited about it.
Oh, I would definitely pay to see that.
Right. But I actually think in a different type of culture, and it is actually happening more and more if you look at certain movies, but basically stories of everyday life are becoming people are being more intrigued in it. But just to know that when you look at the world or any sort of concept, you have to actually put energy into taking off the hero's journey lens before you start to, evaluate. So the archetype that I use a lot in my work is the trickster.
I love
and
that
the trickster is really one of my favorites. It always has been. But again, if we look at the trickster through the lens of the hero's journey, at best, the trickster becomes an anti-hero, but it's usually a villain.
Yeah, think of Loki.
And that's in our culture. Yeah, Loki, exactly. But and I say this a lot, people laugh at me, the Marvel series Loki, the TV series, I think is one of the most important mass media sort of productions for men today.
It's
because it does
awesome.
not follow, well, it's a great show, I mean, sure, but I'm actually wanting to put out a small, like a little mini course about every episode and how it shows and portrays men in a different way, because
Mhm.
in addition to being a phenomenal show, it does not follow the hero's journey archetype. Loki is neither a hero, a villain, or an anti-hero. He's just a person. Loki is, gender neutral, and sometimes
Mhm.
he lives in the gray. Um, you know, Men in the man box and in traditional masculinity, typical masculinity, are really encouraged to see things black and white, good and bad, all of those things, and also not to take that much responsibility, right? Like, we do it, if we win, we're right, and if we lose, it was because you were wrong,
Mhm.
and what's interesting about trickster archetypes, and Loki's a great example, is that they recognize that life is a zero-sum game. If you make a left, you can no longer make a right, and you take responsibility for things. So, Loki, who has a grander vision of things, or I would suggest has a grander vision of time, space, and history, one of the, not the MCU Loki, but in the Norse Loki, right, was, did things that got him in trouble that then later on proved to be helpful,
Mhm.
right? And so, to me, mature masculinity is to be able to say, look, this is not going to be popular, but I think it's important. That's a trickster attribute. It's really not very much a kingly attribute or a warriorly attribute. And so the idea of working with men to embrace sort of tricksterism, I joke that, like, dad jokes are the modern remnant of the trickster, and they're important because of that.
Yeah.
So, I think the trickster is an archetype that I particularly love, and the trickster is often the storyteller. The trickster is often the bringer of information, and also the questioner. We talk about, like, the jester, who is the only one that can give bad news to the king because they can do it
Yeah.
with humor, right? And so they are also the ones, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name, but the Greek god that brought fire to humans is considered a jester, right? Or a trickster, excuse me. I forget his name. It'll come. Someone
Yeah.
will tell us, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to think who that is.
but like these, so
It's not Prometheus,
you
is it?
know,
No, that was.
yes, it was Prometheus. Yes, it
It wasn't?
was.
Okay.
And yes, I believe it was. And so, these characters, they're storytellers, they're information bringers, they're also challengers of the status quo, right? They will parody and make fun of the powers that be. And a lot of the argument is, in our culture today, where there's very little space and time for real tricksterism, the powers that be start to buy their own crap.
Well, and I
And
like the archetype. Sorry to interrupt. I like the archetype of the
yeah,
jester because the jester can speak truth to power, as you mentioned. And I
yeah,
often feel like that's what I'm doing, challenging status quo, challenging man box, the patriarchy, but also challenging men of incredible wealth to look at their own
yes,
bullshit. And that's a
absolutely.
fine line to walk.
100%. And yeah, because you don't walk it right, you lose your head.
Yeah.
And so you're right. And it is this, there's also because of that, there's an indomitable courage in the trickster or the jester, or those kind of things. And so, but it's a radically different courage than the magician, the warrior,
Mhm.
right? The courage of the warrior is to follow the rules and to have a code and to listen to the king and all of that. Whereas,
Sorry, I'm thinking
what's that? Yeah.
Lancelot.
Oh yeah, yeah. They
He
like
broke the rules.
he did break the rules, and actually, some have argued that Lancelot was more of a trickster than a warrior.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, it makes sense.
And yeah, there is some of that, and but the trickster's prerogative in courage and speaking truth doesn't come from an outside source saying you've got to do this for God and your country. They're doing it because of a sense of, like, what's right and what's
Mhm.
and that's always debatable too. And so living in the gray is one of these things where we as a culture don't do that so well.
No. We don't.
Yeah.
We get stuck in that black and
So
white, all or nothing thinking. So
exactly.
turning pages a little bit here, I've also was thinking that I think both of our careers we've made, we find it important to help others inject space between their selves or the masks that they wear and culture. And I was curious how you help people to gain a little bit of air between mask and self.
I love that's such a well worded question. I'm gonna have to remember that. Um, I
Because
I
I'll
think
give you a minute to think about it,
yeah,
because I mean, I
yeah,
really think,
please.
especially for this man box phenomenon, one of the reasons I harp on it so much is it's the air we breathe. If we're a goldfish, it's the water we swim in. It's so close to us that we don't even realize it's happening. We don't even realize that it's infested our thinking and how it's
Yes.
impacted us. And so it's a tall order to try and get some space for most men between their socialized, how they've been socialized for their whole life, and
Yeah,
who they truly are.
absolutely. So I'd love I'm having trouble giving an answer that isn't a subtle plug. Would that be okay?
That's fine.
Okay. Just because the answer to your question is so much of what's behind the Journeyman program that I run. I have 25 years of working in an office doing psychotherapy with men. And about 10 years ago, I was just realizing like I could have these incredibly powerful sessions with men who would walk out the door into a culture that like didn't give a shit about what we were talking about. And no matter how powerful the session was, 20, 25% of our gains were gone because as they walked out the door, they were hit with misogynistic advertising or expectations or, whatever it was. And so that began the thought of like, I want to do something outside the realm of psychotherapy where I can build more of a community where guys can define this space and create that space between culture and themselves kind of together in a liminal space, in a space between. And it then overcame to a place where I was sitting with a guy in a session, and quite literally on the other side of my door in my waiting room was another man that I had this thought in the middle of the session that if I could just open the door and invite them to meet one another, they would both have significant less need for me as the therapist.
Right.
But I'm literally not allowed to do that. Like ethically, legally, I cannot
Don't you
do
hate
that
that?
without, yeah. Oh
Yeah.
gosh.
Drives
So
me nuts.
that's where coaching and journeyman started to evolve. And in real staying true to this questioning of the hero's journey we were talking about, many men's coaching programs use the hero's journey as their core curriculum. And I was like, I don't want to do that. That's not what that's clearly not where my thinking is. But I wanted a core curriculum or a core story that my journeyman curriculum would fit into. And the metaphor really came, and this is to answer your question of creating the space. My favorite scenes in all of my favorite movies and books, even when I was a kid, were never the swashbuckling dragon battling. What they were the inns and the taverns and the pubs and the cantinas. And, even as a kid, that was my favorite kind of thing. And I started thinking like, well, why do people go to those places, right? They go for fun, right? And recreation, but they go to hear stories and tell stories and be seen. They go to nourish themselves and relax and get some food and some rest. They go to get new tools and, fix their stuff and rest their horses. They go to get, information from the shady guy in the corner. But they go to get a new quest, right? And so for me, all of what Journeyman's story is based around, all of the work I do is based on, is we create an inn where guys can come in, drop their shoulders, and go, let me tell you this, and so we have this space that's outside of their own adventures, right? Like as a coaching program, my program is not the adventure. Your life is the adventure, but you can step out of that into the inn and get nourished and get some tools and get a map and then go back out and then come back and be like, guys, I got to tell you, listen to what's happening. And so to answer the question directly, how do we make space between the culture and our masks and things, is we literally make space. We meet up and spend time together. the work that I do is about asking. So, well, what does this mean if? Or what do you think this says that you do blank, or you think blank, or experience, so and so? The idea that we deconstruct and identify cultural stories, right? Like, oh, what you're explaining, it kind of sounds like a movie. What movie might it be? Oh shit, yeah, it's a movie. Like, I don't want my life to be this movie, and so we look at the cultural stories and roles that are sort of placed upon us, and then question them. And that's what makes the space, is really questioning these taken for granted stories. And the first thing we have to do is see them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think self-awareness is a first step for all of this.
Yeah.
And I like your metaphor of the inn, because one of the things I was thinking that we go there for is for connection. And I think men are, I could say it a couple different ways, but really, really longing for connection right now,
Oh,
particularly
absolutely.
with other men.
Absolutely.
And to your point, that's why I started my men's monthly dinner, because I had the same awareness that you did. I'm like, shit, like my thought was everyone I'm talking to is struggling to find adult male friends because we lose them. They atrophy for a variety of reasons as we get older. And so I just went to each one of them and said, hey, I'm thinking of starting this men's monthly dinner. We'll meet once a month. We'll have dinner. There's no cost other than your own dinner. There's no agenda other than connection. Are you in? Every one of them said, yeah. And now the list is up to 30, and usually 8 to 10 show up, and we have a good time. We laugh, we tell some stories, we commiserate, and we normalize each other's time on the planet, which is huge.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, I mean, that connection is really one of the most. I mean, I love the idea of a men's dinner. The company that actually runs Journeyman, the parent company that I started, is actually called Nourished Connections. I'm a cook. That's what I do outside of some of this work, and the idea of literally breaking bread, or gluten-free bread, with other people is really, you're right, it's at the core. Like, let's sit down and eat together. Let's someone once said to me, if all of this work got you where you wanted to be, what's your dream? And I was like, I want to invite all the men to dinner.
Yeah.
So I love that you're doing that.
Consideration. Yeah, there was somewhere else I was going to go with that. I think that's the other reason why I enjoy talking about the man box culture and the effects it has on men, because I think one of the biggest barriers to this, to getting that space between mask and self, is defensiveness. And we are socialized that our go-to emotion is most often anger, which is going to smack of defensiveness and externalization of blame. So often when I'm talking about man box culture, I'll say, look, realize this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. You didn't ask to be socialized like this. It just happens. However, it is your responsibility to evolve beyond it.
Absolutely.
And
I mean, and yeah, that's well
I think
said.
there's truth to that. And I also think that it's a way to get into some men's minds where they can exhale and go, oh shit, you mean it's not my fault? Like, oh, and they can actually consider the idea long enough to get that, breathing space.
Well, and let's take it even further. It wasn't your parents' fault either.
Yeah, they were just doing the best they could in the culture and context that they were living in.
Absolutely. I mean, so as I'm sure you see, so many of the men that I talk to, we also talk a little bit about their relationship with their fathers, or their, or and whatnot. And, I actually get chills when I think about it. But like, when men start to realize, like, oh, my dad was just a man too. And he was, I actually am thinking about one guy who was in one of my groups about a year ago. He came in with this goal that he wanted to be able to create a better foundation of relationship with his son. About a quarter way through the thing, we had a private meeting, and he said, I don't know if that's the right goal. I actually think I have a great relationship with my son. And I was like, all right, well, let's explore a little bit. And what came of it was he healed a relationship with his father in a way that he never expected, and that he never thought was going to be, even on the table. And it was surprising to him, but really powerful into the point where even to this day, grandpa is now part of his grandson's life in a way he never would have been.
That's
You
awesome.
know?
Hey,
Yeah.
Jason, speaking of this, may I ask you a personal question?
Sure, of course.
What did you receive or learn from your dad that you appreciate? And what did you learn or receive from your dad that you would rather get rid of or leave behind?
Very good question.
You've got to be all on top of this. I got to imagine you've thought about this at some level.
Oh, so much. And it's interesting because, my dad and I have a great relationship and we have a lot of things in common. He was a social worker.
Wow.
So we have some interesting similarities. He was, for his time, quite liberal.
Yeah.
So I would say, what I got from him, and this is something that I've said a lot of the journeyman work and concept and perspective is about, chop wood, carry water. Or I had chop wood, carry water, break bread. Like we do what needs to be done because that's valuable, not just because it's a chore, right? And
well, also, can I add something to that? Because that's a famous book title, right? From Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
And
right.
The reason I remember reading that book when I was like 19, and I was like, I don't know what the hell this means. And later I was like, oh, what it means is be mindful, be present in whatever it is you're doing, and lose yourself in the task. So if you're chopping wood, chop wood. Don't be caught in, the negative past or the negative future. If you're carrying water, carry water. If you're being with your family, be with your family. Sorry,
absolutely.
Throw that in.
No, and I think, we can have a whole hour just even about that phrase because yes. There's so much more to where that can go. But I think that's something that I take from my dad is that, a great example, and it wasn't even from growing up, but when my son was born, lots of chaos, newborn baby, we're at home, we're all that kind of thing. And anytime you looked, my dad was like cleaning up the dishes and doing the dishes. And, he wasn't like, let me do something big and help you all. No, he was like quietly, like, let me do what needs to be done. And I've taken that as something for me is really important is what needs to be done. Let's do it. Let's make it happen. And not in like a masculine fix it sort of way, but in a service sort of, an element of like a servant, you're it's a discipline where we do what needs to be done because there's meaning and there's value, right? There's more treasure in doing the dishes than going off and battling dragons, in my opinion, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's really what I got from him. I think a couple things in terms of things that I got from him that I actively try to move away from is, I think he sometimes struggles with being as engaged. So sometimes, his own sensitivities might cause him to isolate a little bit. He's not, even for a social worker who is quite liberal, not as emotionally expressive as I think I would like to be and that I would like my sons to be. I told I had a conversation with my 15-year-old about journeyman and the work I do. And I said, Poppy, who's my dad, I said, Poppy doesn't say I love you to me that often. And I said, I know without a doubt, because of who he is and who we are, that he does, and he loves me deeply, but he doesn't say it that often. And that's okay. But my son says, you tell me you love me all the time. And I said, yeah, that's, and he said, and Poppy says he loves me. And I said, yeah, Poppy's done his work too. Poppy's doing his work and that's important. But I said to him, you realize that lots of men aren't comfortable with that. That isn't something that they, they'll show it through doing stuff. They'll show it for lots of ways. But the idea of expressing and cuddling and like that element, one of my journeymen, one of the guys said, I want to do this because I want my 10-year-old to be as comfortable holding my hand at 20 as he is at 10. And I want to be able to encourage that in him. And that's very much about what I think, my father who always does what needs to be done and who's always there. I think if I called him right now, he would be here in 6 hours coming from New York. He would do it in a second. But in terms of emotionally, just being willing to go there, right? I think that's something that this next generation of men, we have to evolve towards.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And so we only have, I don't know, 5 or 7 more minutes, but one of the questions I wanted to get to was the topic of bromance, because it feels like every Jason Segel movie maybe ever made. But talk a little bit about the bromance and how that trope has really kind of hurt us men.
Yeah. Years ago, I ran a men's group, a therapy group. And I'll never forget, one of the guys who was a stay-at-home dad said, I finally saw another dad at the playground, but now I feel like I'm dating. I have to figure out how to get his digits. and and he was like, I don't know what to do. It feels weird and awkward. And what if he doesn't like me? And, and I was like, yeah.
Friend
And
anxiety.
it was so poignant, because he's like, I see all these women, moms, like chatting away, and a new mom comes up and they're like, come here, and they envelop her. And I certainly am oversimplifying mom dynamics, and so I don't want to speak to that. But like, he was like, as the only male, I was often sitting alone, or feeling like, do these moms think I'm just like the divorced dad who has visiting hours? Like, what's, and so, the idea of bromance was very real for him. And then I think about it, and it's like, the fact that there is a genre of movie specifically designed to like parody, mock, or portray
all comedy.
Men having friends, all comedy, is, the idea that it's even called a bromance is so mired in sort of homophobia and patriarchal thinking that it feels almost like, even if it's a feel-good comedy, even if it feels good that they finally became good buddies, right? The fact that it had to be overcome to sort of, that we're friends, all of this, it has a real, again, going back to stories impacting, cultural stories impacting our individual, it has an impact on kind of who we are and how we say. And, men who have deep and meaningful male friendships are rare. Like, it is such a hard thing. And, I tell a story of my deepest, closest friends. I'm almost 50. I've been friends with him since we were 12. And we've been really close friends the vast majority of that time. It was until our maybe late 20s or early 30s where we could say, I love you. And even then it was, I love you, man. I love you, man. And then it was into our 30s or 40s where it turned into, I love you, brother. I love you, brother. And it was only in our late 40s, after a 35-year-old friendship, where I could really look at him and say, I so value your friendship. I love you. It took, and I'm a pretty open guy. He's a pretty open guy. And it took that long for us to really be able to do it. There's a problem there, culturally.
Well, and to what extent? I mean, because one of the man box tenets is don't be homosexual.
Right. Yeah.
Along with don't be feminine. But to what extent do you think that socialization process harms or impacts our ability to have other male friendships?
Dramatically. I mean, I think by definition, right? There is this it's sort of understandable but weird thing that a close friendship for men is somehow equated with a romantic one, right? Like, I love that guy, no homo. Really? And so to be emotionally expressive and receptive and connected for a man must be relegated to his sexual partner.
Well, I think that phrase "no homo" is, I mean, that speaks volumes. I remember hearing that for years.
Yeah, it's horrific, and it speaks so much to this, to power over or dominance, like who's in control here, right? And there's clearly, right, being gay, being a woman is clearly in the man box seen as lesser than. And it is something that is either overt, lots of men we know overtly buy into this, or really subtle. I'm sure you and many of your listeners would say, like, I know men who are pretty liberal and who would say they're feminist, but still have these like subtle expressions of that we have to do the work on. We have to notice, myself included.
When and I'm thinking about what do men typically do if they're going to hang out with a guy friend, a male friend? And for some reason, my mind goes to like hyper masculine activities, like gun range comes to mind. A little bit of an exaggeration, but
Right, right, right.
but I think even on a lesser scale than that, like, okay, let's go to the bar, we'll have some
Yeah,
drinks, and it requires
yeah,
the alcohol to lessen the inhibitions before we can actually get to anything meaningful, if we ever get there at all.
right. Yeah. I hang out with my buddies. I mean, I say it, I've used this before and recently in some talks that I've given, but I can't tell you how many men have said something to the effect of, if my wife left me, I'd have no one to tell. But I
Mhm.
have buddies, I got friends.
But I talk to them about cars, women, and beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so the
And
question I
and
have for
and
most men
sports.
is, to what extent, yeah, sports, thank you. I forgot one of the major four. To what extent are you comfortable speaking at anything beyond surface level? Or to what extent are you comfortable speaking with your male friends about, or in ways that don't involve things like sarcasm, put down, one-upmanship, and joking?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, that's a great question because, having people become more aware and mindful of their own practices and things like that is essential, right? Like the awareness of it is so powerful
Yeah.
because then you kind of go, oh, yeah, like that is the way I talk with almost all my friends.
And not that I'm opposed to humor or joking. I mean, I'm the jester, so I love
Yeah,
all that shit. But I think it's
absolutely.
also really important to look at, are those the only ways I can connect with other men?
Absolutely. And I would say also, this isn't to demonize beer, cars, sports, or women, right?
No.
Like those are also really fun
Yeah.
conversations to have if they're not the only ones and if they're
Right.
not in this certain thing. And, I actually had a guy in my group who's like, just so we know, just so everyone knows, I do like drinking beer and watching football. And I was like, yeah, there's nothing
Cool.
wrong with
Me
that.
too.
That's
Well, I don't
awesome.
know about
Yeah,
beer, but maybe something else.
Right. Yeah, no, and I'm not a sports guy, but well, I like high school. I watch my kids' sports, which I love. But anyway, um, but yeah, it is really interminably harmful for the in the limitations because then you have guys who go out and do things and come home and are just as lonely as they ever were,
Yeah.
just as isolated, just that,
Well, Jason, I got to
excuse me.
say, I've greatly enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
I feel like I should have a little button. I want to have a button that I can like have applause. So I can say, Dr. Jason Frishman, everybody, and then hit the button. Woo. But where can people get a hold of you if they would like to find out more?
Sure. The easiest way is I have a website. It's www.journeymenfoundation.com. That's the easiest. And I assume you have show notes. We can have that in
Yeah, yeah,
there.
yeah. Well, put all that in the show notes.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram. Instagram is a lot of my cooking. So if you're interested in that, you can put that out there.
Excellent.
Um, but I think, the website or just email, jason@nourishedconnections.com. Those are, and
Excellent.
at this point, I'm in a place where, it's just me. And so if you email me, you'll get a response from me.
I love
I'd
it.
love to have a conversation and connect with anyone.
Well, and thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been a joy.
Absolutely, John.
And
Likewise.
it's the beginning of a friendship. Let me put it that way. So thank you.
You know what? You
And
took the thoughts out of my head. Yes.
and that is it for this episode of the Evolved Caveman. If you liked or loved this episode, please be sure to rate, review, and share. If you didn't like it, you don't have to do a damn thing. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.